fictional character of James Bond was created by author Ian Fleming. The super spy made his first literary appearance in Fleming's book Casino Royale in 1954, and Fleming went on to write 14 more Bond books. But it wasn't until actor Sean Connery played him in the 1962 film Dr. No that the name
Bond. James Bond
began to become a household word. While the Bond character actually appeared first in a 1954 TV adaptation of Casino Royale by American actor Barry Nelson, it wasn't until Connery portrayed him that it caught fire. In fact, there wasn't even any plans to make a sequel at the time. But Dr. No was such a huge hit that Hollywood wasn't about to let James Bond fade away. But did you know that author Ian Fleming based part of James Bond on a real person? Fleming knew and wrote about a man named Forest Fredrick Yeo-Thomas, someone also known by the code name the White Rabbit. It's believed that Thomas was one of the main inspirations behind the fictional character of James Bond. Thomas was also called the bravest of the brave, and the situations he often found himself in were just as dangerous and hair-raising as any Bond film. Thomas parachuted into France 3 times when it was occupied by the Nazis. He was eventually caught and tortured by the Gestapo, but later escaped from a concentration camp. In fact, some of the predicaments that Thomas found himself in have been used in various Bond films. Forest Yeo-Thomas was born in England in 1902, and many who knew him just called him Tommy. When he was only 16, he lied about his age in order to serve with the Allied forces. He later joined Poland in their fight against the Russians. When he was captured by the Russians and sentenced to death, he strangled a guard and then escaped the night before his date with the executioner. After his military service ended, he eventually became a manager of a dress shop in France. It appeared his military days were behind him. He was now 39, but very patriotic, and had strong feelings both for his birthplace of England and of France, where he was educated. When Hitler and Germany began their assault on Europe, he was forced to leave his dress shop in France. He hated what he saw as Hitler's forces controlled the streets in France and seeing all the fear in the French people's faces. Thomas tried to re-enlist, but he was rejected because they said at age 39 he was just too old. But after much persistence and the help of commanding officer Colonel James Hutchinson, Thomas was finally accepted. It wasn't long before he parachuted back into France to assess how the early resistance movement was faring against Hitler's forces. This is a photo of Thomas taken just 8 hours before he parachuted into occupied France in September 1943. He was provided with false papers and took on the identity of a Frenchman named Francois Théry. His mission was to observe and create strategies for obstructing the German occupation of France. Thomas had to memorize every detail of his false life, from birth date, where he was employed, military service, and much more. They parachuted into France in late February under cover of night. Aside from many supplies like guns and fake papers, he was given a ring with a secret compartment that contained cyanide capsules. This was to be used if he was captured and tortured and there was no way out of the situation. After this mission was completed, he was sent on a second mission to France later that year, where he was to organize and plan strategies with various underground group leaders, find out what the most important supplies were needed most. During this mission, he ended up riding on the same train with feared Nazi Klaus Barbie, nicknamed the Butcher of Lyon. He was infamous for having personally tortured prisoners of the Gestapo, and Tommy had to drink tea at the same table as Barbie, not knowing if Barbie knew his real identity. Fortunately, Tommy spoke fluent French, and Barbie had no idea who he was. This incident is similar to a scene in the film From Russia with Love, where Bond dines on a train with a dangerous enemy agent. Thomas later avoided capture by hiding inside a hearse and returned to London. He then personally told Winston Churchill what supplies the resistance needed. In February 1944, Tommy parachuted into occupied France once again. He was to assess the damage done by the arrest of 2 leading resistant leaders. This last mission to occupied France did not go well. After his contact, a man called Antonin was late in showing up at their agreed-on meeting place, Tommy violated his own rule, and that was to leave immediately if a contact wasn't there. Suddenly, Tommy did finally see Antonin, but unfortunately it was because Antonin was under arrest by the dreaded Gestapo. He must have done some talking because Thomas suddenly felt hands on him. He tried to run, but more agents appeared out of the crowd and he was dragged to a waiting car. Thomas was repeatedly beaten and tortured, but insisted that he was the downed pilot Kenneth Dodkin. When he was arrested, it was only a few hundred yards from where his father lived. Tommy knew that if he admitted he was the White Rabbit, the Gestapo would grab his father and torture him in front of him until he talked. The interrogators had made a mistake and had not taken Tommy's cyanide ring, and the next chance he got, he had decided to take it to stop the beatings and the misery he was in. But just then a senior officer came into the room and saw the ring on Tommy's finger. He was furious at the men for not taking off the ring. He pulled it off Tommy's finger and discovered the cyanide inside it. I won't go into the rest of the terrible details, but the ordeal that Thomas went through is almost identical to the scenes from the Bond film Casino Royale. Despite all of this, Tommy never gave in or gave away any other agents and was finally moved to a dungeon cell. Later, he was sent to the Buchenwald concentration camp, where he and other captured agents were kept separate from the other prisoners. In September 1944, 16 fellow prisoners from his group were taken and then hanged in the crematorium basement. Thomas realized that they had to come up with a plan because they were probably next. With the cooperation of concentration camp Dr. Ding-Schuler, he and 2 other prisoners were able to take the names of 3 prisoners who had died of typhus. The doctor only did this because it was becoming clear to him that the Allied forces were winning. Thomas said he'd put in a good word for the doctor during wartime trials if he allowed the name switch. Thomas then became Maurice Choquet, and he eventually ended up in Reimsdorf as a medical orderly in horrific conditions. In April 1945, the camp's prisoners were loaded on a train towards Czechoslovakia. When they stopped to bury dead prisoners, Thomas and some of the others escaped into the woods. Unfortunately, within a few days, he was caught just a few hundred yards short of the Allied lines and placed in a French POW camp. But only 2 days later, he and 10 others escaped that camp. Thomas and 2 of his fellow escapees crossed a minefield to reach the Americans. Incredibly, Thomas hadn't even recovered from dysentery and boils when he began to plan a return to action, and it was surprisingly approved by Special Operations. Tommy had gained a lot of respect from anyone who knew of his service and his bravery. His plan was to look for and find concentration camp guards who were still hiding in Germany. But when he requested submachine guns and assassination pistols, that raised some red flags. After all he had gone through, it was clear and understandable that he most likely was planning some payback to the monsters who had tormented him and his fellow captors. Fearing that Thomas would go on a mission of revenge that might have repercussions, they returned Thomas to France so that he could close down his old networks. In 1946, Thomas produced evidence that helped send 22 members of the staff at Buchenwald to the gallows. He was also awarded the George Cross and the Military Cross by the British government. Thomas died in February 1964 from a brain hemorrhage, most likely the result of all the previous blows to his head. If you want to read more about Thomas, there are some excellent books out there, including The White Rabbit by Bruce Marshall. But the next time you watch any 007 film, you may want to stop and think about Forest Fredrick Yeo-Thomas, the guy who sacrificed so much to stop Hitler's forces and is the real James Bond.